The first time it happened, I didn't think much of it. I'd just planted a line of oaks along the property line of my suburban home, their slender trunks reaching for the sun like fingers stretching for a promise of privacy. By the following week, though, I noticed the sharp smell of freshly cut wood drifting over the fence. My neighbor, Mr. Hargrove, had been at it again, trimming the lower branches of my trees without so much as a word. I peered over the fence, jaw tightening as I caught sight of him with his saw, humming a cheery tune as if he had every right in the world to reshape my property. "It's for the neighborhood," he said when I confronted him. "Keeps everything tidy." I clenched my fists, trying to swallow the surge of anger. "Tidy," I repeated. "Or convenient for your view." Weeks passed, and the intrusions continued. Every time I planted new shrubs, a few days later, branches were missing or leaves shredded. Every time I put up garden decorations, they seemed to disappear overnight. I tried talking to Mrs. Hargrove this time, polite, friendly, civil, but she just smiled and said, "We're just helping. You should be grateful." Grateful. The word stung like a slap. My property, my labor, my life fit was theirs to meddle with, apparently. And the worst part, the city's regulations were vague. There was no clear law against trimming branches that overhung into someone else's property line, which gave them the loophole they loved to exploit. One particularly sweltering summer afternoon, after yet another assault on my landscaping, I decided I'd had enough. I didn't want confrontation, I wanted poetic justice. I sat on my porch, notebook in hand, plotting. If they were so concerned with appearances, I'd hit them where it hurt most, their property value. I started small, planting wildflowers and pollinator-friendly bushes near the Hargroves line. They bloomed spectacularly, but not in the neat, regimented fashion their HOA handbook adored. I made sure the plants were hardy, vibrant, and, most importantly, sprawling. At first, they ignored it. They were too busy planning their next attack on my shrubs. But soon, subtle changes appeared. Their meticulously trimmed grass began to look less polished as roots from my flowers crept into their edges. Birds and bees arrived, and while they loved the pollinators, they despised the disorderly movement of petals and pollen scattering across the pristine lines of their yard. One evening, I caught Mr. Hargrove on the phone with a real estate agent, complaining about the unruly greenery spilling. I smiled quietly to myself. Small victories. But I didn't stop there. The neighborhood prided itself on having perfect lawns, straight hedges, and symmetrical flower beds. I decided to challenge that notion directly, using my own property as a staging ground. I introduced small architectural anomalous stone pathways that wound like streams, a slight slope here, a tiny pond there. From their vantage point, It was chaotic, unpredictable, almost artistic, but utterly violating every standard of suburban perfection they worshipped. I could see them standing at their windows, muttering, frowning, shaking their fists. Every glance they threw my way fueled my resolve. Then came the coup de grace. I knew the Hargroves were obsessed with home values. They talked about it constantly, comparing prices, attending every HOA meeting, listening to every whisper about market trends. So, I hired a professional landscaping evaluator, someone who could calculate potential property value based on aesthetics, upkeep, and curb appeal. I didn't need to break any laws. I just needed evidence. The report came back, and it was damning. The disorderly expansion of neighboring properties, as it was euphemistically phrased, would likely decrease the Hargroves' property value by several percentage points over time. I made copies. One went in the mail to the Hargroves with a note. "You've been helping me for years. I thought you'd like to know. It's starting to reflect." The response was immediate. Their carefully curated lives, built on neat hedges and squeaky clean fences, began to unravel. The HOA called me in for a meeting. Concerned about my creative landscaping, I listened politely as they lectured me about compliance and appearances, nodding in exaggerated agreement. Behind their backs, though, I watched the Hargroves argue in furious whispers, pointing at my garden with frustration. The irony was delicious. Every trimmed tree, every metalled shrub had led to this escalating chess game in which I controlled the board. They retaliated, of course. Overnight, someone spray-painted my driveway with chalk designs. I responded with a garden fountain that night, illuminated with solar lights that reflected in the morning dew. Each countermeasure escalated the tension without touching the law, without touching them directly. Neighbors started noticing. The tension was palpable. Some residents were amused, some horrified, some quietly siding with me. I kept meticulous notes, documenting everything. Every action I took was strategic, deliberate, a lesson in patience and foresight. Months passed, and the Hargroves' desperation became evident. Real estate agents tiptoed around their home, remarking on the influence of surrounding properties in hushed tones. Offers on their house were lower than anticipated. They hired tree surgeons, landscapers, consultants, none of which could completely mitigate the effects of my deliberate artistic chaos. Every dollar they spent to fix one issue inadvertently amplified another. They were trapped in the labyrinth of their own obsession with perfection. And I watched from my porch, sipping iced tea, feeling a sweet sense of vindication. By the next spring, I had transformed my property entirely. Wildflower meadows, stone paths, and creative landscaping became my signature. Birds nested in the trees the Hargroves had once clipped. Bees pollinated the flowers that had crept onto their lawn. And even the wind seemed to dance differently over my yard. The Hargroves, meanwhile, were frazzled shadows of their former selves. Every trip outside a calculation, every glance at my property, a silent scowl, and the neighborhood. They began to take notice. Compliments to me increased. Murmurs of approval circulated in HOA meetings, while the Hargroves' criticisms sounded more like whining than authority. One day, as I was planting a new row of lavender along the property line, Mrs. Hargrove approached me, her heels clicking against the stone path. I braced for a confrontation. Instead, she extended a shaky hand. "I admire your dedication," she said softly, "even if it drives us crazy." I took her hand, smiled, and nodded. "It's called balance," I said. "Sometimes you give a little. Sometimes you get back exactly what you put in." She walked away, thoughtful, perhaps reconsidering everything she thought they had controlled. The moral, I realized, wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about the property value or the perfect hedge. It was about boundaries, respect, and creativity. They had assumed control over my life because they could, and I had taken it back with patience, strategy, and a little artistry. And somewhere in the chaos of colors, scents, and shapes, I found a satisfaction deeper than any victory against them could provide, a personal triumph over intrusion, a reclaiming of my own space. By the time the next HOA meeting rolled around, my reputation had grown. Neighbors came to admire the gardens, the flowers, the stonework, and even the small pond that reflected the sky with serene clarity. The Hargroves were silent, frustrated, and increasingly isolated. Offers on their property had dropped, not catastrophically, but enough to sting. They had lost control of the neighborhood's perception, and ultimately of the petty power they had wielded over my life. I sat quietly at the back of the meeting, observing their simmering anger, and allowed myself a private smile. Justice, after all, need not be loud to be effective. And so, life settled into a new rhythm. My garden flourished, vibrant and untamed. Birds nested freely, flowers spilled over boundaries, and I spent evenings tending to the pond, my hands in water and soil, feeling more connected to the world than I had in years. The Hargroves continued their futile attempts to police aesthetics, but their efforts were now small ripples in a pond far larger than their control. Every morning, I stepped outside, inhaling the scent of lavender and wildflowers, watching the oaks sway in the breeze, and smiled quietly. They had learned, too late, that meddling with someone else's life comes with consequences. And I had learned irrevocably that patience, strategy, and a little creativity can turn the tables in ways no one anticipates. The trees still grow, tall and proud, along the edge of my property. They sway gently, brushing against one another, as if in quiet conversation, a living testament to persistence, ingenuity, and the subtle power of taking control when it matters most. And every so often, when a bird lands on a branch near the Hargroves' fence, I think of them trapped in their obsession with perfection, and I chuckle quietly to myself. After all, in the end, beauty and just as always finds a way.